Now it announces itself. Um, so nice to be back. I don't think I need to go through the whole spiel about what the Zohar is this evening, because we're all veterans here. But I did try and do what we've done before, which is look at something close enough in the Zohar to what we're reading in the Torah portion, in order to look at a passage to study tonight. Um, as you may know, that's actually very difficult because there's only a tiny fraction of the Zohar that comments on Deuteronomy, which is, of course, what we're reading in Shul right now. About 60% of the Zohar is on Genesis, and about 38% on Exodus. And then there's like a tiny little fraction at the end of actual material, which is everything in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It was hugely imbalanced. I don't know if if they ran out of time or if actually they just didn't care as much in terms of the material that they wanted to cover. Since the Zohar is focused on theology, understanding God and people and society and whatever, it actually isn't too bothered about much what happens in the narrative sections in the wilderness. There's a few exceptions. There's a couple kind of weird little novellas that are inserted in the commentaries on Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but largely there's not a lot there. So what I've done is there is a little bit of commentary on VaEthannan, which is now 2 weeks ago's Torah portion. And so I've done is taken two passages from that, unrelated passages, in which we get two different views on two different topics, both of which I think are interesting for different reasons. Um, so the first one, just make sure I have them both here. The first one is is about morality, about good and evil. And the second one is about Moses and Joshua and his experience of prophecy, both of which are obviously very Deuteronomic themes, right? When Deuteronomy is very focused on morality in a way the rest of the Torah is not, the whole idea of Judaism being ethical monotheism is entirely derived from Deuteronomy, in which is the only place you really have a huge focus on ethics, and is the only place you really have any sense of monotheism. Right? Deuteronomy is really the only place where it says explicitly there's only one God. All the other gods you know are this God. That's the only one. It's really only when Moses is restating at the end of his life his whole vision of what happened where you get such clarity. When you look at the narrative sections in Exodus, it doesn't really say anything so clear as that. There's some language that God uses about exclusivity, etc., but it's a little bit fuzzier. So it's also not very prescriptive about morality in the same way. Obviously, Leviticus is very focused on what the priests do, but it's a code of behavior in a particular context. And there's lots to learn from example in Exodus and in Numbers, mostly what not to do. But Deuteronomy is the place that we have this real layout of good and bad and how to behave, and particularly kind of society level. So that's partially, hi Laura, that's partially what the Zohar is going to pick up on, is the focus on ethics in Deuteronomy, which is one of the things that they're exploring. And the other big facet of Deuteronomy, obviously, which we're also going to look at, is the fact that it's the end of Moses' life. He's giving his last will and testament. Deuteronomy is in some ways an ethical will on behalf of Moses, what he wants people to remember. And so a lot of Deuteronomy is as a result around what happens when Moses dies, Joshua taking over. What is the Israelite people going to look like after Moses is gone? And who is Moses to them? Which is actually a much bigger question for the Zohar than it is for the Torah. The Zohar is willing to explore much more this idea that Moses is someone exceptional, someone superhuman, whereas the rabbis did not want that at all, right? They didn't want to introduce these ideas of Moses being different than other people. They removed Moses from the Haggadah, right? We read the Pesach story and we don't talk about Moses at all. And all of that was because they were nervous that people would turn Moses into a deity because of his unique privileges. The Zohar isn't as worried about that. As usual, the Zohar is worried about different things than mainstream rabbinic thought. And so they're exploring what makes Moses exceptional in the second passage. So this just kind of as forms of introduction, I'm going to share the screen. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to type both of these up in the way I normally do. So we're dealing with copies, which is less reliable. If anyone has, if it's useful, I will also put these in the chat if it's easier to look at it on your own screen on a separate device. Let me just grab those links, and I will put them in the chat. So this is the first one. You should be able to open these if you'd like to from there as well. And this will be the second one. Incredibly long links. Apologies for that. Okay, so the one we're looking at now is this one, which I've mislabeled in the notes. It's actually page 267b from volume 3, at the very end of the actual material of Zohar. And I want to start with the comment here on Deuteronomy 6:6. Now, you guys may realize where this is from. David, where is this from?
From the Shema.
Yeah. All right, this is the paragraph we recite as part of the Shema, which we know is the Ve'afta. And that's where the word that's beginning here, these words that I command you shall be upon your heart, Deuteronomy 6:6. That's what the Zohar is commenting on. So let's read a little bit and see where they go with this. They're going to go in a weird direction first, but they'll come back around. David, do you want to start for us, since you already said something?
From Rabbi Yitzhak?
Yep.
So Rabbi Yitzhak opened, all my bones will say, Yud-Kei Vav-Hei, who is like you, saving the poor? And that's from Psalms 35:10. This verse was uttered by David through the Holy Spirit. All my bones will say, now. Who has ever seen bones chanting a song? However, this verse refers to when the Blessed Holy One will one day revive the dead, and he will arrange the bones, drawing each one to its place. As it is said, he will invigorate your bones. Then they are destined to chant a song.
Okay, so as usual with the Zohar, right, we're playing this game of weaving connections. So there we're starting with the verse from Deuteronomy, but not talking about it yet. Instead, Rabbi Yitzhak is bringing another verse. This is typical, right? He opens, meaning he grabs another verse from Psalms, Adonai, mi kamocha, and then connecting that back. And the introduction to that is, kol atzmotai tamarna, all my bones will say. We do say this somewhere in the liturgy. And asks, of course, a very reasonable question, which is how are bones going to talk? And then the Zohar answers, well, this will be when the bones are reinvigorated at the resurrection of the dead, which isn't really the main focus, but it's kind of a cute idea. I don't know if you ever saw that old animation from the 90s of the skeleton, the singing skeleton. Had a very catchy song with it that now I can't remember, but if I did, it would get stuck in my head. That's what I imagine when I read this. The bones are singing like dancing skeletons.
Could we
that's
make
not the
any
main
connection? Could we make any connection between this and the dry bones from Ezekiel?
Very good. Yeah, well, the dry bones vision from Ezekiel 37 is where the basis of resurrection really is. Right, this idea that you're going to come back to life after death is something the prophets introduced. It's not the Torah. It's very much a product of the prophet's imagination, and particularly Ezekiel's image of dry bones, where he has a vision of a valley around the temple in the future in which all of the bones of the people who are buried will come back to life and be reinvigorated. So for sure, that enters the language of Ezekiel and then of Psalms very easily. Okay. Do you want to go on?
What song will they sing? Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, who is like you? So Ad Hashem mi kamocha. They will immediately offer a song superior to the one that Israel sang at the sea, for they mentioned the holy name only after 3 words, as it is written, mi kamocha ba'elim Ad Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. So you see there the 4th word there. Who is like you among the gods, O Yud-Kei Vav-Kei?
Right. So
yeah.
Right. Obviously, the point contrasting the Psalms text that David says, where he starts with saying Adonai mi kamocha, versus the text from Song of the Sea, which we obviously know very well, mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai. Right. Who is like you among the gods, Adonai. So they're saying it'll be much better in the future when the bones are singing, because they're actually going to put God first, as opposed to the Israelites in ancient times who put God fourth, right? Which is a really, again, hyper literal way to read the text, but that's typical for the Zohar, is to read it hyper literally. They state the same in finishing the verse here, right? Whereas here, the bones will put the holy name first, as is written, Adonai mi kamocha, Adonai, who is like you. Okay, so that's the first part of the quote from Psalms. That's actually not so relevant to what we wanted to look at today. So just to remind you, right, Rabbi Yitzchak brought this quote from Psalms, all my bones will say Adonai, who is like you, saving the poor. They explored the first part of it, the who is like you. That wasn't actually the main idea. Now they're going to go on to the second part of that quote from Psalms 35:10, saving the poor, right? And that's what they're going to talk about for the rest of the passage we're looking at. So the rest of that verse is saving the poor from one stronger than he. This is one of the things we label about God, that God saves the disadvantaged, the widowed, the orphaned, the poor, the oppressed from that one who is stronger than them. God is the rescuer of the oppressed, and they're going to give that a particular reading here, as we'll see. David, you're on a roll. Do you want to keep going?
Saving the poor from one stronger than he, the good impulse from the evil impulse. For the evil, so this is what we talk about. I take it the inclination, the good inclination, and the evil inclination, what we know as. To the poor, the stronger than he is the good impulse from the evil impulse. For the evil impulse is hard as stone, as it is said, I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, whereas the good impulse is flesh, as it is written, and give you a heart of flesh.
Okay. So, anyone not familiar with this system of good impulse and evil impulse? Also, more often translated as good inclination and evil inclination. Yeah, Robin.
Well, not that for me. I mean, it makes sense, but I mean, I haven't sort of studied in that.
It's a rabbinic innovation, right? There's nothing in the Torah about these two kind of warring aspects of personality. It's also a psychological description, not a theological one. So it's not saying that you have a good and an evil soul. It's saying that there are kind of two opposite drives in the human psyche, one towards good and one towards evil, although it's not that simple. And part of the religious life is to try and moderate those, understand those. Now, the rabbis have quite a few things to say about these. So first of all, they call them, right, the Yitzrot, right, Yetzer Hatov and Yetzer Hara, which is rather a strange word, right? We translate that as inclination, Yetzer, but as you may or may not realize, right, it's actually from the same root as creation, right? Yitzira, to form something, to shape something. So like a mold, right, or something which shapes something else might be how you would translate Yetzer. It's a word about artistry, about kind of making something an artisanal way. You know, Yotzrut, right, is probably, how would you translate Yotzrut, David? It's like artistry.
Yeah.
So that's I think one of the things that's missing in the translation of good impulse, good inclination, evil inclination is actually the language of it, Yetzer Hatov and Yetzer Hara, implies creativity in some way, that these are kind of molds or pre-existing kind of pathways that you can take. I'm not sure exactly. Impressions, sketches. I don't know. This is probably a better way to say it that references the artistic language behind it. But the idea that the rabbis often talk about is that they're codependent, right? So it's not about getting rid of the evil impulse, what they call the Yetzer Hara, and only having the Yetzer Hatov, because that would be bad, actually. There's a famous story in the Talmud in which the rabbis find the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse as it is here, and they lock it up. They put it in a barrel, and one of them sits on top of it. One particularly corpulent rabbi sits on top of the barrel, so the Yetzer Hara can't get out, which is just such an amusing story. And they go outside, and they're all very proud of themselves. Oh, good, we defeated the evil impulse. No one has to worry any longer. Everyone's going to be good now. And what they see is that no one is bothering to have a family anymore, or build a house, or go to work. No one's doing anything, because although in the wrong amounts, right, that impulse um, towards Yetzer Hara. I don't want to say evil because it's not right, but the impulse that direction can lead to a lot of bad things. Without any amount of it, you actually can't live life, right? You need a little bit of it to drive you, to motivate you, to procreate, to build a house, to have a family, to engage with the world, to work a job, to earn a salary. If you don't have any Yetzer Hara, then you're really going to struggle. But it can't overpower the Yetzer HaTov because then you can't control it. So it's actually, I don't think it's an overstatement to say it's a very acute form of kind of pre-modern psychology, right? 2,000 years ago, the rabbis are kind of thinking about psychology as we would call it now by imagining these two things. It's not so different the way they talk about it from, the id and the ego in Freud's sense, and that there's a kind of good visible part, which is the Yetzer HaTov, which drives you to be good and do good things and be seen to be good. And then there's the Yetzer Hara, which drives you to do bad things, but also is partially what motivates good things as well. And they are in dialogue with each other. So that's what this text is playing with, right? The Zohar now is taking those rabbinic categories of the two Yitzrot, the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, and playing with them again, messing around with them, right? And they start by talking about it in this two imagery of the evil impulse is hard like stone, right? It's hard to change. And the good impulse is flesh, which degrades, right? It doesn't last. Stone lasts, but it's changeable, it's flexible, and it's living and dynamic. So it's a really powerful image, actually. And the image comes again from Ezekiel, in which God tells Ezekiel in one of the prophetic visions, I'll remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Just a very strange image, but one that actually works quite well for us thinking about this idea of the good impulse and the evil impulse. Any thoughts about that before we dive into what they're saying, Robin?
Yeah. So just thinking about what you were talking about, the corpulent rabbi there, if you remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you where the good impulse is flesh and give you a heart of flesh, then where's the balance in what remains?
Yeah. So that's what's really interesting, right? Is part of the reason I wanted to go through that is to show you that the rabbis actually do, the original rabbis, meaning the sages of the 2nd to 6th century, which we just call the rabbis, and they actually have a very balanced view of it, right? The stories like the one of them trapping the Yetzer Hara give us a sense that it is balanced. Actually, it's not about being righteous or being sinful. It's actually about having the right combination and the right amounts of each. The Zohar doesn't necessarily feel the same. So, that's what's quite interesting is the places where the Zohar diverges, and it diverges much more towards what we might call a pietistic view of kind of, trying to suppress and eliminate evil, as foolish as we may think that is. That seems to be the view that the Zohar is trying to have, and it begins by giving us that image from Ezekiel as the image to think about, where one thing is being replaced by the other. Right? You're removing the evil impulse, excising it from your body, and then replacing it with the good impulse, which skeptically I don't think is really possible, but that seems to be the language they're using. Yeah.
I guess so. You could. So I agree with you in terms of skepticism. I agree with you, but then it's sort of, there's something a bit circular about it, which is about the sort of purity of the definition of good and evil. So if you've got a sort of a different definition of good, then maybe it's okay to only have the good. If your definition of good is a sort of a more practical definition of good, if you like, so in terms of good outcomes rather than necessarily purely good drivers. So do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. I think you're spot on as well, because the difference partially between how the rabbis thought and how the mystics of the Zohar think is that the Zohar has a real objective understanding of good and evil as real concrete things, right? The Zohar talks about demons, it talks about possession, it talks about satanic angels who torture human beings, right? It resembles much more Christian views in some way, where evil is a real living thing which has a power of its own and which is threatening and scary and dangerous. Whereas the rabbis rejected that entirely, right? They rejected that partially because They were living, remember the rabbis, second to sixth century, mostly in Babylon, which is run by the Sasanian Persian Empire. All of their neighbors were Zoroastrians, right? They understood, and their context was Zoroastrianism, which is the ancient Persian religion of two opposing forces, a good god and an evil god, who are fighting against each other. So for the Zoroastrians, there's a real sense of objective quality to good and evil because there's a good god and an evil god, and we're just living in the battleground between them. That influenced Christianity a lot, which is how we get the idea of the devil in Christianity. But the rabbis didn't like that at all, and they really distanced them from themselves to the extent that one of the famous statements about the evil impulse, Yetzer Hara, from the rabbis is actually from that corpulent rabbi who evidently sat on the barrel. His name was Reish Lakish. He was also a gladiator in the Roman arena, the Colosseum originally, and a bandit before he became a rabbi. Fascinating dude. Anyway, he said the evil impulse, Satan, and the angel of death are all the same thing. Right? Famous statement of him in the Talmud to say actually, which is the opposite of saying evil has a real objective thing. He's saying your psychological state of doing something wrong and the idea of an adversary which accuses you of your crimes and the notion of death are all one and the same thing, which is arguably, as a result, less powerful. So that notion of the rabbis that actually the Yetzer Hara is a perception and not an objective reality is not shared actually by the later mystics of the Zohar, who reject that and suggest that evil is a real thing which can really be eliminated, and much more go towards that ancient Zoroastrian view of there being a war between good and evil, and we have to take the good side. Right. So they're going to give us another image. They give us a few images. So we have the hearts. Let's see the second image here. David's drawing on the screen. Can't draw any rude gestures. This isn't cheder.
No, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't do it on purpose. Press
That's
the wrong
okay.
button.
Yeah, I can take it away. There we go.
Thank you. I wouldn't have known how to take it away.
Right, let's see. David, do you want to read the next image they give us?
Let someone else read. Let someone else read.
All right. Well, I can't see Lee or Laura. I don't know if they're there. So, Robin, do you want to read?
Okay, so come and see. What does the evil impulse resemble? When it comes to attach itself to a person, it's like iron before being put in the fire. After it is heated, it turns entirely into fire.
Right.
Rabbi here said,
Sorry to interrupt, Rob, but just before we go on, what is that image, that analogy, that kind of image we're meant to have in our mind? What does that say about the evil impulse? A lot of us don't have working fireplaces these days, so it's less relevant to us perhaps than our ancestors. But what is the image of what evil is as a result?
It's something different once it. I don't understand actually.
When it gets hold of you, then it really does get hold of you.
Consumes.
It consumes. Is that what you said, Lee? Yes, it consumes. Right. So I haven't spent a lot of time with fireplaces, but I get the image actually a little bit, which is that an iron, which is cold metal, right, before you put it into the fire has no energy, right? It's just cold metal. But once it's exposed to the fire, it actually retains that heat, right? Iron is obviously it has a resonant heat for a much longer period of time, to the extent that it might seem as though it's actually turned into fire itself. And of course, eventually, with enough fire, with enough heat, it would melt and become fire and be consumed by fire. So I don't know if it's more that iron would melt in the fire, because that takes a lot of heat actually, or more that actually if you put an iron in the fire and then you pull it out, just because it's out of the fire doesn't mean it's not hot, right? There's a imprint that's left by contact with the fire on the iron. If you pull an iron out of the fire, it is red, right? Red hot iron for a long time. That's how they would brand animals and whatever else, because it retains that heat for a long time, and it retains that heat even when it's totally removed from the fire. And I think that's more the image that they're trying to give us here, is actually when you're exposed to evil, remember they really think evil is a real thing, then the exposure doesn't, it leaves marks, right? If you separate from the evil after that, it doesn't mean that you've kind of separated from the evil entirely, because you, like the iron, are heated by it and you retain that heat, and it changes you in a way that doesn't easily dissipate. So it's not like evil is something you can just touch and then remove yourself from. It's actually something that sticks around in a way that's very threatening, which of course is the image they're going to give us next, which is my favorite.
Is it also that, that all makes sense, but is it also that actually, unless it's attached to a person, it's totally, it's banal, benign, or there's nothing to it. It needs to be attached to a person to become something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they don't say that, but I think that's absolutely part of it, is this sense that evil is only powerful because we give it power, and that actually, if you didn't put the iron in the fire, it would never get hot, right? That it's not going to get hot on its own. It's only because someone moved it, and there's that element of agency there that's also very common in Christian thinking about evil, where actually there's a lot of language that, a lot of the medieval Christian thinkers would also say, evil doesn't really have any power except for when we invite it in, and that's all the language around possession, around kind of demonic activity, is that it's not something that comes unbidden. There's always a reason for it. Someone did something to invite it. Which is how we ended up with witchcraft, trials and persecution and whatever, is trying to find the people who they believed were inviting evil in, which is a very dark road to go down, right? Which Judaism never went down the same way. But you do see the same kind of thinking here in the Zohar of evil being a real thing, which is kind of parasitic, which is exactly what Rabbi Chia, as Robin, if you want to continue, tells us in this next passage.
Rabbi Chia said, when the evil impulse comes to attach itself to a person, it resembles someone who has been traveling along and approaches a door. At the door, he finds no one restraining him, so he enters the house and becomes a guest. Seeing that there is still no one restraining him, he indulges himself and becomes master of the house, until eventually the whole house comes under his control.
Right, so what's this image?
This is an image of sort of consuming, I think, like these words.
Yeah.
I think it's the same image as that fire. When the iron, when it comes to you, it takes hold of you, and eventually the whole house comes under its control, or after it is heated, it turns entirely into fire.
Yeah, and there's a sense here of gradualness, perhaps, that isn't there in the iron, which is very, the sense that there's these stages along the way. It's like a wayfarer who comes and sees a door. If the door's open, he goes in. If no one stops him then he continues. No one stops him then he continues, which of course leads us to think that there are all these kind of moments of decision points where one can stop and kind of arrest the evil impulse. But if you let it go too far, then you lose the ability to actually control it any longer, and it controls you. Which is a very scary idea, I think.
There's also this, I think, in both of those examples, there's like an element of it where you are the object and the evil impulse is the subject.
Mm-hmm. Say more about that, Levy. That's really interesting, actually.
So in the iron example, you are like the iron, almost like the inanimate object, and the subject is the thing that has agency there and is acting on you. And then in the second example, you are like the house, which again is the inanimate object, and the evil impulse is the person who arrives. And that's the thing with the agency.
And what does that tell us, though? It's such an interesting observation. The grammar of it implicitly is reversed in some way. We're not talking about us acting on evil, but evil acting on us. So what does that tell us about the perception of evil here?
That it's a force or like an environmental factor. We don't do evil. Evil does us.
Really good, yeah. Right. This is exactly the kind of thinking that tells us that these guys think evil is a real thing, with agency, with cognition. And this is how you end up with a force like the devil in a lot of Christian literature, which appears in the Zohar as well, is like a real persistent and active, strategically minded force of evil, not just something passive, but something which is out to get us. And actually, we become the passive thing. We're just subject to its whims. Again, going all the way back to that Zoroastrian influence, in which the concept of the world is that there's these two gods fighting, and we passively are caught up in their battle. We are kind of, affected by what they're doing. In a sense, very similar to being acted upon in this image of the evil impulse being the agent.
We were reading about possession a couple. I mean, is possession always viewed as evil in the Zohar?
So the possession that occurs in Kabbalah is always the possession by spirits of the dead. There's not this idea that demons can possess people, because demons are conceived of in a really animalistic way, and mostly because they come about through influence of Babylonian religion on the Talmud. So there's not really the same kind of, the exorcist idea of kind of a demonic presence, but there is a sense that the souls of people who have died can be trapped in living bodies. And what's similar about that, which is a really good thing to bring up, is that in that case as well, it's something that has to be invited, right? There's, in all those cases that we looked at, in all the stories, there's always some incident that happened where someone did something and that opened the door to allow the spirit to kind of come into their body. So there's a similar kind of active passive play there, where something you might do, even something passive or something you're not even aware of, can make you something to be acted upon by these kind of forces around you. In that case, the spirits of the dead, and not demons precisely, but similar. Yeah.
I think it's also highlighting the weakness within us, going back to where it's saying saving the poor from one stronger than he, because we are the poor, and he comes into the house because we let the impulse, the evil impulse in. He enters the house and becomes a guest. So we allow him to come in thinking he's not going to do any harm. And it's like a little bit like the slippery slope, I'll come in, I'll do this little thing. It's not a bad thing, because that impulse is having that influence over me. And he starts, and then he grabs slowly, he it takes more and more of a hold on the person, and eventually consumes, as we've said.
Yeah. This absolutely right. This next paragraph from Abachia is the same image. Unusually for the Zohar, he gives us the image first and then explains it. So this is just kind of it unpacked, right? Which he says, from where do we learn this, right? What's the proof? From this passage about David, where it says a wayfarer came to the rich man. So this is in the second book of Samuel, in which Nathan is using the proverb, a parable of the man who stole the sheep in order to criticize David. So it starts out with a wayfarer came to a rich man, which to them, of course, a wayfarer, approaching the door without wanting to linger there, rather to proceed on his journey. So is the evil impulse. Like someone approaching the house, he approaches a person, arousing him with a minor sin, i.e. a temporary guest. If he sees no one restraining him, what's written? To prepare for the guest who had come to him, that's the next part of that verse. He becomes a guest who lodges in the house, arousing him with sins for a day or two, like a guest who's invited to stay in the house for a couple of days. I love this idea that it's kind of like an unruly house guest. Once he sees there's no one restraining him, what's written? He prepared it la'ish for the man who had come to him. He becomes master of the house, as it says, ha'ish, the man who is lord of the land, ish, husband of Naomi. So it is with the evil impulse becoming ish, a man, master of the house towards that person. Now the person is bound to his service and performs his will. So this is just kind of breaking down what we saw using this verse from 2 Samuel. That's where he gets it from. Remember, this verse has nothing to do with what Rabbi Hia says it is. That's just the way the Zohar uses the text of the Tanakh. But it's also quite interesting, the additions here to the image, where we have this sense that there's kind of stages about time, right? So first it shows up and kind of, tests you out by having you do one or two small things that, no one really notices, not a big deal. If nothing bad happens, nothing tries and stops him, then he stays over for a few days and it gets slightly worse. And then if no one stops him there, then he becomes the master of the house, right? And they use this very interesting connection between different places where the word ish occurs, both in the verse in Samuel, where it says la'ish, for the man, and elsewhere where it says ha'ish, the man, or ish as a husband, all places where the word ish references a householder, someone who's in charge. someone who's the master of the house, to kind of connect that verse as a way of understanding this image. So Rabbi Chia reads that verse from 2 Samuel to be an analogy for the progress of the Yetzer Hara, kind of shows up, and then it prepares to be a guest, and eventually becomes the one in charge. I find quite terrifying. What other reactions would you have to this? I don't want to spend too much more time on this. We want to go on to the other bit. There's an interesting bit they go on next without this. Actually, maybe we should just keep on this one and leave Moses for another time. But in this image in particular, what strikes me is that this resembles a lot how we talk about addiction. If anyone's kind of spent time thinking about addiction or addiction recovery, right? We often think about this the same way, that, oh, well, you try something once, and if you like it, and if you start using more, you develop a tolerance, right? You start using it more and more, and then you need more of it, and the more you use, the more you need, and then you stop using the drug, and the drug starts using you, right? Someone else is in charge. And the way that we talk about addicts, especially addicts in recovery in a 12-step program or similar, is that they are people without will, right? One of the steps of the 12-step program, for those who aren't familiar with it, is you have to kind of surrender your will to say, I'm not in charge of this. I am the subject. I'm the object of my addiction and not the subject, which is exactly how we talk about evil here, right? That it's something like an addiction, which shows up at first as a minor thing and then becomes something that's tolerated, and then eventually becomes something where you lose control and you are controlled by it. It's a very interesting idea. Yeah, Robin.
Just thinking about something that you did in your Thought for Thursday a few weeks ago, and I haven't read the book, but I was talking to a friend about it before you mentioned it. The Merlin Sheldrake book about fungi and their ability to control, the behaviour of the insects or whatever, and indeed us, in terms of the bacteria and in our gut affecting our feelings and our moods, and it feels a bit. I mean, this is again. There's something. This is a sort of a purity, but an impurity, if you like, of evil being the thing. But you can think about just something taking control. Growing.
Yeah.
Growing in power over you,
it's a really interesting thing to point out, because here they're talking about evil, right? And that's the language they're using. But actually, what they're suggesting is something that we are now scientifically coming to have to accept begrudgingly, right? Which is actually, we are not the subjects we think we are. Human subjectivity is largely an illusion. Right, so Lee, in pointing out like, oh, this is really strange because it makes us the object and something is acting upon us. The reality is most of the discoveries we've made in science recently as a species point out to us that we actually aren't in control of very much, right? We're dominated by millions of bacterial organisms which live in our gut. We can be controlled very easily by pheromones, right? Fungi are evidently conspiring in order to enslave us to their will. Right, it's a little bit kind of scary when you start to look more into how little we actually have control over our own lives and our own behavior and our own thinking, how easily it can be affected by something else. If anyone's ever experienced or been around someone who's experienced a traumatic brain injury, it often is a moment where people realize like, oh, my brain isn't this inherent integral thing that I thought it was. If you poke this part, then this thing happens, which is very destabilizing. Right? Because the reason that's destabilizing is because we live under the illusion that we are the subjects and that we are in control. And that if we do something bad, it's because we chose to do something bad, which is the premise of Deuteronomy, right? Is that we have complete choice. That's what Moses says. I put before you life and death, good and evil, choose. Choose which one you want. But the ability to choose actually isn't so clear, right? It's not only so clear that we have the complete ability to choose without other factors. Not to say we don't have free will, but it's obviously the case looking at science now that we have additional elements that complicate our free will. Yeah, Laura, I see your hand raised.
Hi.
Digitally.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about this, and I'm reflecting on something and just wondering what comes to mind from your perspective, like in hearing this reflection. So I've spent quite a bit of time studying Buddhism and in Buddhist community, and this idea that you're talking about of like we are not the subject is really just very common and like in the water of the whole tradition, and it's not that rare. And I'm wondering why it seems it has become or is more rare in Judaism and Jewish community, just from your perspective.
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think so in several of the Vedic traditions, not just Buddhism, but in many, there is a basic kind of split over whether or not there's a self, right? And it's often labeled in I think the Pali terms originally of either Atman, which means you have a self, or Anatman, which means you don't have a self. And Buddhism largely, I think without any exceptions, falls into there is no self, right? Anatman tradition. There's no self, which means there is no you, right? And that's a large part of the whole idea of kind of letting go of the world and letting go of grievance and of suffering. That suffering, for at least classically in Buddhism, suffering comes about as a result of the illusion of control, the illusion of selfhood, the illusion that actually things should be different and you could stop them. And once you release that, then you're liberated from the cycle of suffering, right? I mean, that's a very kind of 101 version of it, but that's definitely the case. And the thing is that the reason that it's different, I think, largely, the reason why this isn't as common in Jewish spaces is because of that question of the self and whether there is an inherent self. Now, in the Torah, there's no idea of soul, right? There's no language around soul, around this idea of there being an essential self. The only idea we have is that there's the breath of God, which goes into the human being in the beginning of Genesis, and that when someone is alive, it's because they're animated by God's breath. But that idea, that image of God's breath is actually the same for every living thing, humans, animals, plants, whatever. That language is used elsewhere. So actually the idea of there being a soul is not actually one that occurs in the Torah. It's one that introduces itself to Jewish and Christian and Muslim thinking through Greek philosophy. And the reason that it's not present in the Vedic tradition as much is because the influence of Greek philosophy was so much less. So to some extent, we being the West, Jews, Christians, Muslims, take for granted the idea there is a soul. That's not because it says so in the Torah. That's because Plato said so. And the effect of that is very deep on our psyche, even if we don't realize. So it's not impossible as a Jewish person to explore the idea that maybe there is no sense of soul. Maybe there's not this sense of inherent self. The Zohar starts to, because it introduces the idea that what we call the soul is actually a compound, right? Which we've talked about before, right? We've looked at texts where it talks about the soul being made up of lots of little pieces, lots of different elements, which does start to kind of chip away at the idea of there being an inherent subjective self. Because once you introduce the idea that your soul is made up of thousands of tiny fragments, is that really a self then? Or is it just kind of a composite of little bits that's temporarily arranged? So there's kind of a halfway step that the Zohar goes to and that Kabbalah goes to, but it's very rare to see any Jewish text go to the full step of saying there is no self, there's no idea of soul. Even though you could do so on the basis of the Torah, they don't, because it's so deeply ingrained in our tradition from Greek philosophy. Yeah, David.
Interesting, and I can understand and hear what you're saying about no soul being spoken about in the Torah itself. However, we've come to this passage through looking at the Shema, and in the Shema itself, we're told to love God with all our heart. And the English translation generally says with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, which is interesting because when you're saying it's not discussed. And here we're being told, if you take the English translation, to love God with your soul. So we'd have to ask, well, what is this soul?
So how else could you? So the English translation is maybe the problem there. How else could you translate that?
I agree with you. I'm agreeing. How else can you translate it? I mean, nefesh. People have struggled to translate it. Scholars a lot wiser than myself have struggled to try find a translation for that word, which is why I say the standard translation is soul. If I was looking to translate it and not use the word soul, I'd probably be looking like your self body, because yeah, exactly, Laura. Yes, your being, you yourself. Yeah, as you know,
I think you could
I,
even, Laura said being in the chat, right? I think
yeah,
you could even
good shout.
you could even go less theoretical and say, I think a reasonable translation of the chol levavecha uvechol nafshecha would be with all of your mind, because that's really what levav is, although we'll come to that in a minute in this text. And for nefesh, with every breath, or with every breath you take. Cue the police. Every breath you take, right? That's what the chol nafshecha probably means. Not with all of your soul, because what is that to Moses? What notion does Moses have of a soul? Right? Even if we think that Moses is influenced by Egyptian beliefs around the life after death, even there it's not exactly the same as the soul that we come to have later. Or there is an idea of there being a soul that's weighed against the feather of truth and whatever, but that's not really probably something that's relevant to what we understand in the Torah. It's probably just about breathing. All of the words we use for soul, nefesh, ruach, and neshama, which are used at different points and translated as soul, as you say, David, are all words to describe breath.
Yeah, I was going to, well, that was one of the words I was going to use, breath. There's also the concept of that, the translation meaning with all your thoughts, with all your words, and with all your actions.
Right, which is abstracting
So
it a
like
bit.
you say,
Yeah.
the lev, the heart, is what you're thinking. Nefesh, what you're breathing, is what you're saying, and your strength is what you do. So it's thought, speech, and actions.
I like that, and that solves our problem to some extent, doesn't it? Because that's secondary, right? That's not something essential about you. What you think, what you say, and what you choose to do, those are things that are non-integral, right? They're things that come out as a secondary result of how you live in the world. You, whoever you are at this moment. And it's scary for us to explore, but there is room there, even in something as essential as the Ve'afta. There's room there to explore the idea that maybe this isn't about a soul, an inherent self. Maybe, as Laura said, the idea that we see in Buddhism is possible and compatible with what we see in the Torah. But it means that we have to really push back against a huge amount of rabbinic tradition, which is derived from its contact with Greek philosophy, which believes very firmly that there is a soul. Which is fine. We can push back against that, right? And that's always the case in Judaism. We can change everything but what's in the Torah. So we can mess around with the rabbis think and play with it, as the Zohar does with the earlier rabbis, but we can't change what the Torah says. And in this case, we have an ambiguity, because the Torah doesn't tell us that people have a soul and what happens to that soul after you die. There's this weird image of Sheol, right, where the shades, the ghosts of the living go down when they die to the underworld, but that's not really relevant in some way to our conception of soul either. It's a really interesting question in terms of what we talk about when we say, and this is why I really wanted to look at this, because it's so familiar to us. We say it, some of us say it twice a day. V'chol levavecha, uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol me'odecha. Right? With all of your, as you conventionally translate it, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. That's the conventional King James translation. In reality, none of those three words are heart, soul, or might, probably. Right? They're probably with everything that you think, with every breath that you take, and with everything that you are, right? The whole me'odecha, with all your veriness, with all the things that you do. So there's a way in which actually we're deluding ourselves when we look at the English, which is common. And lest we become too depressed, I want to see a little bit about what they suggest as an antidote to this pervasive, parasitic understanding of evil. Someone want to read from here? Maybe Lee or Laura, if you're up to it. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
I can read. So starting from the top
Please.
there.
Yeah.
So a person should set words of Torah upon him, thereby breaking him, for there is no opponent to the evil impulse except for words of Torah. Thus it is written, these words that I command you today shall be upon levavecha, your heart, upon your two impulses. Rabbi Yehuda said, why does the good impulse need words of Torah? He replied, the good impulse is adorned by them, and the evil impulse is subdued by them.
Okay, just pause you there for a second, Laura. So what's the antidote to the parasitic influence?
The words of the Torah.
Yeah, Torah. Torah is the only thing. Studying, of course, it's rabbis, right? Studying Torah, thinking about Torah, that is the antidote. This is actually based on a statement in the Talmud that's used many times that calls Torah Sam Chaim, right? The spice of life, which is an idiom for an antidote to poison, right? So there's an idea there that actually Torah is the thing which can be an antidote. Now, when it says, we're talking about Ve'afta again here, Levavecha, it says upon your two impulses. How are they reading that? How do we end up with them saying that means two impulses?
Oh, this is a great one. There's two explanations. One, levavacha, because it's supposedly in plural, and also because you've got the two bets there in the word, whereas lev is the heart, and lev, why have you got the two bets? So
Yeah. So there's two ways to write the word heart or mind, probably better translated. One is lev, which is the more common, and once in a while you see it written as lavav. And it just seems to be that there was an archaic version of the word that that hung around, which is common in the Torah. Sometimes they is hem, sometimes it's hema, because there was two versions of it. So that's not unusual. But here they're using that as an opportunity to comment on the fact that here it says like these words that I command you today shall be upon levavecha, your two hearts, is because there's the bet is duplicated there, whereas it could have just said lev libecha, right, your heart. So they're reading it hyper literally, as the archaic version that has two bets means that it's meant to be on both impulses, that the words of the Torah are upon both of your impulses. And remember, when we say heart, they really mean mind. So we're thinking psychologically that the studying Torah can actually help to kind of balance out both the good and the evil impulse. It's the thing that helps them. And which is why Rabbi Yehud asked the question to say, well, we know what it does for the evil impulse, which is that it stops it. Why does the good impulse need it? And this lovely response here that's given, which is that it adorns. The good impulse is adorned by the words of Torah, so it's kind of beautified by them. But the evil impulse is subdued by them. So they're dual function, the Torah itself. Which is kind of magical, isn't it? That the words of Torah itself are used as a way to respond to this psychological issue of evil, of subjectivity, just by reciting words of Torah, we can kind of counter its influence. It feels very much like a spell. Okay, there's a lovely conclusion to this passage. Laura, if you want to keep reading for us, where Rabbi Shimon, remember, Rabbi Shimon is the primary protagonist of the Zohar, Shimon Bar Yochai. So whenever he says something, it's usually like kind of the end of the story because he gets to wrap it up. He always gets the last word. So let's see what he has to say.
When Rabbi Shimon came, he said, "Surely this portion of Shema alludes to the 10 utterances, as has been established. Here, these words shall be totality of the 10 utterances. Consequently, there are 10 commands here corresponding to the 10 commandments of Torah. What are they? You shall retell them incisively to your children and speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you go on the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Look, 10 corresponding to the 10 utterances. So these passages are a great principle in Torah. Happy is the share of one who completes them twice every day, for then the holy name is fittingly sanctified in his mouth.
Right, thank you. So it doesn't seem like a direct connection, actually, but Rabbi Shimon's teaching here is just really interesting because I've never seen this before. I don't know if others have. The idea that if we look at the Ve'ahavta, a paragraph that's very familiar to us, there's actually 10, he divides them into there being 10 corresponding words or instructions as to what we need to do, which he understands as being a corollary to the 10 commandments. So I must have counted them wrong, but they're, teach them to your children, speak of them. I assume when you sit in your house with that.
no, when you
Speak
sit
of
in your
them.
house is one of them.
Oh, so that must be, so when you sit in your house is 3, when you go on the way is 4, when you lie down is 5, when you rise is 6, bind them as a sign in your hand is 7, They'll be as frontlets between your eyes is 8. Write them on the doorposts of your house is 9, and on your gates is 10. Probably is how he's counting them. Right, so he's looking at this and seeing these instructions, which, by the way, are all about behavior. Right, these are all about spiritual practice, teaching your children the words of Torah, talking about words of Torah as we're doing right now, talking about them at home, talking about them when you're on the way, talking about them when you lie down, when you rise up. Those are the basis for reciting the Shema twice a day. Is this quote here, right? Putting them on your hand, that's the basis of tefillin, along with the next part, which is frontlets between your eyes. Writing them on doorposts of your house and your gates, that's of course the basis of mezuzah. This is in some ways a very interesting idea in terms of understanding how the words, this is answering how do the words of Torah act as an antidote to the evil impulse. And the answer Rabbi Shimon seems to give is do stuff, right? Do things, engage with the world, get out there, teach, talk, discuss, be in your house, live your life, and use the spiritual practice of studying Torah throughout the life that you live in order to kind of keep the influence of evil at bay, which is very interesting for the point of view of subjectivity that we talked about earlier, where if you're affected by evil, then the way that you can fight against it is actually by reclaiming that subjectivity, reclaiming agency, not by thinking the right way, but by doing the right thing, right? By actually acting out the ideas here and elsewhere. He sees it as a way of understanding how we can correspondingly avoid the pitfalls of the Yetzer Hara kind of infecting us in this very dangerously parasitic image. David, thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, my thoughts on this is the fact that on both occasions, I think I've heard it before, that not directly, but I recall the fact that in the Torah we're using the word davar. So in the Aseret HaDibrot we're using the root davar, things. We say it's the 10 Commandments, but it's the 10 things. And here in the Shema, v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele. And these, again, we're using the root of davar, of these things. So that's why I guess, he can easily compare the two of them, because we're looking at the dvarim ha'ele.
Right. So, and a good point that actually when we use the word davar, we're using it as a way, in Hebrew, davar means kind of the basic unit of meaning, which is why we translate it as thing, right? Because a thing is the basic unit of anything. But it also means the basic unit of speech, because speech is a central aspect of meaning in Hebrew and in the Torah. So davar is also a word, which is why here it's translated as 10 utterances, not 10 commandments, which is a more accurate translation. And because it could have been called the, Aseret HaMitzvot, the 10 commandments, but they're called Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances. And there's definitely a connection there in some way, because what else is speech but an action in some way, right? Thoughts, the evil impulse happens through thoughts, right? It kind of comes in, there's an idea here, and I'm sure people have at different points in life and experience kind of invasive thoughts. There's an idea here that kind of the evil impulse will pass you by. If you're not careful, it'll kind of come in. And then if you're not careful, it'll get worse and worse and worse. And it'll kind of take over your brain. It's very cognitively focused. And then at some point, actually, you run the risk of losing control of your thoughts, that you're being puppeted by the evil impulse. And the way to respond to that is not, as you might think good thoughts, right? Counter those bad thoughts with good thoughts, but it's actually to say things, as the Torah talks about, and to do things. That's the way that we can counter it, which is a very Jewish response to it, and also a very useful one if we are interested in dispelling the idea that there's an inherent self, because our thoughts are less reliable than we think often, but what we choose to do, the behaviors in the world, the impact we leave, the effect that our breath has when we use it to speak, that's actually something that doesn't require a soul for us to understand as part of our life. And there's something very immanent, very mindful about approaching our response to evil, not as thinking the right way, having the right ideas, but actually about just kind of living in a good way as a way to avoid the control of evil. So it's quite an interesting take on Deuteronomy. It's quite developed in ways that we haven't seen elsewhere, but it's very different than the rabbis would suggest in the Talmud and elsewhere. Robin, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, just before you said the word mindful, it just felt like mindfulness in terms of, to control bad thoughts sort of taking over, one technique is to just do something and be in the moment, and that's, it feels quite a lot like that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a common misconception, right? Is that people think that what it means to say, oh, you should be in the moment or you should be mindful, is that you have to replace bad thoughts with good thoughts. That's not really possible. It's the least helpful thing you can tell someone who's having a bad thought invade their brain, say, oh, just think differently, right? Because the reality is we don't actually have much control over that. Some of us can practice it, and you can get better at controlling thoughts, but ultimately we're largely kind of the passive object of our thoughts more often than we are the subject of our thoughts. So control is actually really difficult and not something that's easy for most people to maintain. But distraction, by bringing it out of the cognitive and into the physical, is actually a really good tactic. It's good for kids. It's good for anyone. It's a good way to respond to that kind of invasive, encroaching feeling of losing control, is actually to do something, to use the physical substance of our bodies, whether or not we have a soul, to do something good. And the Zohar's suggestion that that's what Deuteronomy is about, which is kind of what they're getting at, right? That when Deuteronomy says choose life and not death, choose good and not evil, they mean actually that the approach of the Torah as a antidote to the poison of evil is a very different one. It's not an equivalent. And it's not said in such clear terms, but I think in looking at this, we can get a good sense of that. And although it's a bit scary, it does seem more modern, actually, ironically, in some way. Because increasingly, as time goes on, this idea of 100, 200 years ago, of the rationalists like Voltaire, that actually humans can be completely rational and can make their own decisions and nothing will affect them, I don't know if that's really seen as true anymore. We're going back to a place where we realize that we're more affected than we realize.
It's a little bit about, I mean, what they're saying is study in order to, as an antidote, because if you're studying, then you're not letting the evil impulse take hold of you because you're busy doing something else. It's almost like when we tell our children, if we can keep them busy and give them activities to do all day, then they're staying out of trouble.
Yeah, in some way, it's this. Yeah, sorry.
I think there's, I mean, it's interesting to think about like thoughts as like the weather, or the mind as weather that we're watching. And there's a way, and it comes to mind like the way that I talk to my clients that I'm doing therapy with. There's distraction and there's activities that we can do, and then there's also like finding agency and refuge in awareness itself, which again is going back to like more, there's like a lot to say in Buddhism around that, but there is something, to me it feels like that sort of creates a spectrum, or a sort of combinations where it's not just like we are our thoughts or we're not our thoughts. There's something else going on too, which is this very mysterious thing, which is awareness.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, it's a great, Buddhism has a much better language in some way to think about these things than Judaism often does. But it does feel like there's something in that analogy that Rabbi Chia gave us and that Robin read about the kind of the house guest that doesn't leave. Like actually the danger isn't just that you have a house guest that doesn't leave, but that you don't even realize he's still there. And to some extent, those steps along the way where it says nobody stopped him, that doesn't have to be such an active thing. Sometimes it's just an awareness of, oh, this thing has entered my mind and I didn't realize it was there and it's been there for a while. And in some way, maybe just simply being able to watch that and pay attention to that is itself, like you said, a way of reclaiming agency. It's interesting because there's not a great vocabulary for that, but there is maybe analogies that we can draw.
Yeah, it's so interesting that I would love to find more what there is to say, because like you were describing before and you're speaking to it, like there's so much space for it and there isn't contradiction to it in anything I find in Judaism, but there just isn't what I imagine could be like a wealth of, and there's a lot of interest and there's so much overlap in people doing both traditions.
The place where you do see more thought given to this in a different way is the school of Kabbalah that focuses on prophecy. and which is what in particular, what personally I tend to enjoy studying more, which is the kind of Kabbalah Nebuit, prophetic Kabbalah, which is about how to attain the state of prophecy, what is prophecy, etc. And often that involves exercises, meditations, breathing practices, body movements, things that we often associate very much with Eastern practice, but actually are equally as rooted in Jewish sources. And in those, you do see more attention paid to actually how to record and approach and understand one's thoughts. And there's less discussion of the kind of soul body dynamic in general. It's seen more holistically, broadly, although that's probably an oversimplification. But of a large part of the reason, Laura, that more work hasn't been done on it is because the Jews who have been interested in it have largely just used non-Jewish categories and applied them externally, as opposed to like digging into the tradition and finding those places where there's room to explore it and doing so. Right? There's amazing organizations out there that teach Jewish meditation, but most of them are actually teaching Buddhist meditation with some Hebrew words thrown in.
That's been my
And
experience too. And so
yeah,
many of my Buddhist teachers are Jews who have gone into
yeah.
Buddhist study. Yeah.
This sounds strange, but I've never actually gone into, I think almost every Buddhist monastery in the West I've been into, the abbot is always Jewish. There's a Buddhist monastery here, in Hemel Hempstead, and I went to go visit at one point. It's lovely, really nice place to sit for a
What
bit.
tradition?
So it's the forest, I forget what it's called. It's a Thai Theravada tradition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I probably know it.
Um, I forget what it's called over there, but it's lovely. It's a lovely place. But of course, the abbot's name is like Jacob Greenfeld or something. And there's a reason that when you look at the 1960s and the Beat Generation and whatever else, huge amounts of Jews were the ones who were leading the kind of exploration of Eastern traditions in the West, often in a very Orientalist, kind of romanticized way, and without much actual understanding of those traditions. And it's a bit of a shame, actually, that more of them didn't instead look internally at the Jewish tradition and realize how much there is to do there. One exception, and just kind of plug for Aryeh Kaplan, and he was a really exceptional teacher who unfortunately didn't live very long, but was one of the people who really knew Kabbalah and really understood what the search was during that period in the late 60s and tried to really do that work inside of Judaism in different ways. He does that in a lot of his books. He has great books on Jewish meditation, and one called Jewish Meditation, one called Meditation of Kabbalah, and he wrote commentaries on several works of Kabbalah. And it's just a shame there aren't more people like him. That's one of the things I lament on a regular basis. But it's there's certainly the material, right? And if nothing else, looking at this text this evening has been instructive for that. So it's really nice to get back to this with you all, and thank you for joining me this evening. We're back on a semi-regular schedule, so keep an eye out. I think we're back in September, and yeah, and watch out for the evil impulse staying over as a house guest for too long. Make sure you kick him out.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Really,
Yeah.